folks, thanks for stopping in at Big Mook's Forge. In tonight's video, I will be starting a new campaign in Total War Warhammer 2, The Mortal Empires. We'll be featuring Kroq-Gar, the Lizardmen's legendary Lord Melee specialist. This video is inspired by the battle reports in White Dwarf magazine. A lot of you long-time Warhammer followers will probably know exactly what I'm talking about, but for those of you who are not familiar with White Dwarf magazine or the old battle reports, what they would do is they would play a game and they would document that game with photographs showing the troop movements and everything else. And then they would write a narrative based on what happened in the battle. So basically what you had was you had a story that was written by the players playing the game. And that's what I've tried to recreate in video format. So without further delay, here is my version of the old White Dwarf magazine battle report. Kroq-Gar strode up the main thoroughfare toward the huge temple at the center of Exwattle. Each of his strides were slow but long, methodical and rhythmic, almost as if he were marching to the sound of a drummer that only he could hear. His dispassionate gaze never strayed from his line of travel, as if nothing could distract him from single-mindedly pursuing his mission. The skink priest sent to escort him scurried to stay ahead of him. He was trying to escort him as commanded by Lord Mazdamundi, but it seemed as if this Saurus didn't even know he was there. What was not known to the priest, however, was that this Saurus had spawned in this very city thousands of years ago. Kroq-Gar had become a lord of legendary reputation when he and his brethren had fought to the last man defending the city from the hordes of chaos during the wars following the Great Catastrophe, long before this skink had emerged from the spawning pools. Before they reached the Great Pyramid Temple, they came to a place in the road where there stood two full contingents of the temple guard. They were all armed with great halberds and armored in gold and bone plates. They stood silently, blocking the way forward. Behind them, the great floating palanquin of Lord Mazdamundi could be seen gently bobbing on the magical energies used to move the enormous gold and stone throne. When Kroq-Gar and his escort approached, the two units of temple guard wordlessly opened a pathway between them as they wheeled to face each other. When the movement was complete, each guard lifted his halberd and quickly slammed the butt onto the ground. The maneuver was so perfectly timed that only a single thunderous boom could be heard. Before the Saurus Lord proceeded, he saluted the highly revered temple guardsmen, and his salute was returned by every one of the guards in unison before a single heartbeat had passed. On the other side of the temple guard units, he found the legendary Slan priest waiting for him. Lord Mazdamundi, sitting cross-legged atop his floating palanquin, was dressed for battle, wearing his ceremonial helmet and wielding his scepter that doubled as a mace. His skink attendants were near his side, and behind Mazdamundi, Kroq-Gar saw other units of Lizardmen warriors in marching formations. It was clear to Kroq-Gar that Mazdamundi was setting out on an expedition, and when Kroq-Gar reached a point approximately 3 sword lengths from the front of the palanquin, he dropped to one knee and bowed his head. Kroq-Gar's consciousness was filled with the voice of Mazdamundi, as if the Slan were speaking directly into both of his ears at once.
"Rise, mighty Kroq-Gar. I summoned you not for your submission, but to fulfill your part in the great plan."
Kroq-Gar stood. In his mind's eye, he could see images flashing by. Images of chaos warriors and demons marching into the world of man from the wastelands. Images of dark elves raiding coastal settlements and herding slaves onto their ships. Images of beastmen attacking caravans and plundering villages. Images of vampire lords spreading their vampiric corruption from behind armies of those who'd already fallen in battle. And worst of all, images of Skaven, the most hated enemy of the Lizardmen. The vile ratmen had returned to spread their diseases and plagues across the land. Kroq-Gar growled at the revelations Mazdamundi was presenting to him.
Yes, Kroq-Gar. The servants of evil and chaos again seek to imbalance this world. Again, we must go to war.
Kroq-Gar's one-word reply was both question and answer.
Where?
Mazdamundi had foreseen the Saurus Lord's reply and had barely paused to receive it before continuing on.
The Southlands are in peril. The area is without leadership. The geomantic web is weak. Go there. Rebuild the web so that its strands will again join with those of Lustria.
Mazdamundi spoke in short sentences to avoid overwhelming Kroq-Gar's mind. While he was a very gifted Saurus, he was still just a Saurus.
How much war?
The Saurus Lord asked, contemplating any possible limitations.
Total war,
Came the reply.
Do what you must.
To this, Kroq-Gar slowly lifted his chin while extending his head forward. He emitted 2 growling bark-like shouts. All nearby activity ceased because no one else was privy to the conversation taking place in Kroq-Gar's mind. The skink attendants, the temple guard, and even the nearest formations of warriors all struggled to decipher whether or not they or their lord were in danger. Every eye in the vicinity watched as Kroq-Gar slowly brought his head back down to meet the gaze of Mazdamundi. It's usually hard to tell with Saurus, especially with Saurus as old and distinguished as Kroq-Gar, but those present had no doubt that the expression on the old warrior's face was a smile.
Take with you Ratok, the priest that escorted you to this place. Make use of his talents and consider his counsel. Fight well, mighty Kroq-Gar.
A few weeks' travel by ship brought Kroq-Gar to the temple city called the Temple of Skulls, in the province known as the Kingdom of Beasts. Upon his arrival, he inspected the ancient temple city, and he found that the city had been neglected and was nearly deserted. The Temple of Skulls had fallen from its former glory since the time of the Old Ones, and his mission here was clear. His first order of business was to have the ceremonial spawning poles cleared and prepared for use. Kroq-Gar mustered what few units of troops were available and headed out into the nearby jungle to get the lay of the land. A single unit of Saurus warriors armed with spears and shields. A unit of mace-wielding Saurus warriors. 2 units of skinks armed with javelins and shields. A unit of Saurus spearmen mounted on cold ones, and a feral stegodon were all that could be mustered on such short notice. In addition to being few in number, they were unblooded, meaning that Kroq-Gar's new units had yet to see battle. He marched anyway. Seeing the impenetrable mountain range to his west, he decided to march east towards the coast. Ratok, the skink priest, was overseeing the clearing of the spawning pools when he heard the shouts of the warriors manning the gatehouse. He quickly got himself into a position where he could see the gates and witnessed Kroq-Gar marching from the city with a small contingent of troops. Mazdamundi's words came back to him.
Stay with Kroq-Gar and assist him in all that he does. His importance to the great plan cannot be measured. He will need your magic and your counsel.
Ratok, realizing that Kroq-Gar was about to leave him behind, scrambled down from his observation point and hurried off to catch up with him. Kroq-Gar had marched his troops up the road north and east of the city when a familiar smell came to him on the breeze. Skaven. He was absolutely incensed that the disgusting ratmen were close enough to the temple city that he could smell them. He took his small force and he marched them into the wind, his predatory instincts leading him toward the unseen enemy. He watched his troops carefully as they marched. The Saurus warriors were the first to show the signs of agitation. He could see their heads lifted to the wind, their nostrils flaring, and their anxious glances at the tree line. A short time later, the skinks and the stegodon could be seen lifting their noses to the wind as well. Even Ratok, the city-dwelling priest, seemed to notice. Once he was sure they could all smell that something was awry, he halted his march and addressed his troops.
Skaven,
He spat the word out as if it were rancid meat.
that is the smell that fouls the air. That is the smell that tightens your jaw and speeds your heart. Skaven must die. All Skaven must die. When you smell Skaven, ready your arms. Arms ready!
He bellowed. The troops immediately answered in unison by banging their weapons on their shields, or by beating their chests with their free hand. Sure that his troops were ready to fight, both physically and mentally, he marched them forward. As they crested a ridge, they could see the Skaven formation in the valley below them. Kroq-Gar estimated that the forces were almost evenly matched, but the Ratmen were just out of reach of a good charge. The Skaven lookouts shouted their warnings, and the enemy had already started to react. The Lizardmen had exposed themselves too soon. Had Kroq-Gar not been so angry when he set off towards them, it may have occurred to him to approach more stealthily. A surprise attack would have tipped the scales decidedly in his favor. Kroq-Gar noted his mistake and wasted no more energy on mourning the missed opportunity. The Source Lord and his troops continued forward. He could sense the anticipation building in his formation and observed his warriors as they struggled to restrain themselves and maintain formation. He was pleased that his warriors were both aggressive and disciplined. As his formation marched down into the valley, the Skaven formed up and rapidly marched away from them. The man-rats were known to be light on their feet and were able to outpace the Lizardmen. The Source Lord's formation, slowed by the heavier Source warriors and the Stegodon, pursued at a steady, disciplined pace until the Ratmen disappeared into the tree line. After considering the possibilities, Kroq-Gar ordered his formation to halt. The Lizardmen could pursue the Skaven into the forest, but should there be a battle, his troops would be exhausted before it even started. He also had no knowledge of what else may be in the forest awaiting him. So instead of marching into a possible ambush, the battle-wizened general elected to take some time to gather more information and possibly some more troops. He motioned to his skink leaders, and they immediately sent half a dozen scouts into the forest. Further to the northeast, Kroq-Gar could see the tops of humanoid-crafted structures sticking up above the tree line. He looked to Ratok and spoke.
We know not what is in the forest.
He gestured to the tree line where the Skaven had disappeared.
Kroq-Gar not march in the forest until scouts return. We know not what is in the city.
He gestured to the northeast.
You go to city. Watch. Listen. Smell. Come back to camp and tell me what you find. We make new camp up on hill where we can see far around us.
He gestured to the ridge behind them.
I send for more troops while we wait.
Ratok nodded in understanding, grabbed a few skink runners, and set off towards the ruins. After the priest had left, Kroq-Gar marched his troops back to the top of the ridge. When he found a place that suited him, he halted the march and ordered that camp be made and watches be set. He then called for one of his skink unit leaders to send his fastest runner to the Temple of Skulls to requisition more Source warriors. Satisfied that he had done all that he could do for the time being, he settled down to await developments. Ratok traveled just inside the tree line along the road, headed northeast until he came upon the outskirts of what appeared to be the ruins of a city. According to the plaques along the roadside, the city was last known to be a Lizardmen temple city called the Serpent Coast. The closer he got to the city, the thicker the air became with the stench of disease, decay, and Skaven. He found a place from which he could observe most of the city and remain hidden. If the city had walls in the past, there was no sign of them now. In fact, there were no defensive preparations left intact, and not a single inhabitant could be seen. At night, while he was practicing his newly learned incantation, Harmonic Convergence, his eyes could just make out the faint sickly green glow of warpstone and the movement of shadowy figures amongst the rubble. It was on the third day that he witnessed the Skaven garrison emerge from the city, form up and go out on patrol. He counted 6 units, all flying the banner of Clan Mordkin. One unit had further Skaven markings that announced the garrison leader was present in the formation, and that he was called Scoutpite, the Fabricator. The priest sent a runner out to Kroq-Gar immediately. When the skink scouts returned to camp, they had come with the news that the Skaven formation they had pursued had run to a location west of the ruined city that Kroq-Gar had spied to his northeast. And from there, the Skaven had turned and were last seen heading northwest. When Ratok's runner arrived, he brought news that there was Skaven activity within the ruins of what once was the temple city called the Serpent Coast. Ratok had sent words that the 6 units of Skaven he had observed all appeared to be lowborn Skaven and Skaven slaves. As Kroq-Gar was receiving his brief, his lookouts reported that 3 units of Source warriors could be seen approaching from the west. The Source Lord immediately gave the order to strike camp and to form up. He wanted to march as soon as the reinforcements reached the campsite. Today was the last day that the vile Ratmen would defile the former temple city. When the reinforcements arrived, Kroq-Gar inspected his new troops. They were armed only with single-handed melee weapons. Kroq-Gar had hoped that they would be bearing shields as well, but the runner had advised him that the blacksmiths were struggling to get ahead of the new demand for supplies. He knew there wasn't much use in bemoaning the circumstances, and he would just have to be satisfied in the knowledge that his troops were more than up to the task of pounding some Ratmen into oblivion. With his inspection completed, he issued the order to march on the Serpent Coast and to exterminate any Skaven they could find. Kroq-Gar made his approach to the ruined city by marching right down the road. He knew there was no approach to the city that the Skaven wouldn't be watching. He also knew the Skaven may attempt to ambush his formation. In fact, he welcomed it. If he could draw the entirety of the Skaven garrison out to ambush his troops, it would make the task of clearing the city out after he annihilated them just that much easier. To guard against ambush, he had set his formation up in a defensive posture that could be quickly shifted into a more aggressive stance. Kroq-Gar put his Saurus warriors at front and backed them up with his javelin throwers. Anybody approaching from the front would do so under heavy fire and ultimately end up nose to nose with his warriors. The rear of the formation was covered by his unit of spearmen, the feral Stegodon, and his reptilian cavalry. Anybody approaching from the rear would do so at the risk of being trampled or gored by the monstrous creature, run through by a Saurus spear, or eaten alive by a cold one. Kroq-Gar positioned himself near the center of his formation, where he could be aware of all that happened and respond accordingly. When he got to the point that there was but one line of trees left between him and the first structures on the outskirts of the city, he had yet to see his enemy. Regardless, he knew they were there. He could smell them. As he marched his formation over a small rise, he finally caught sight of his enemy. There were 2 units of Skaven perched atop the hill next to a ruined structure. They looked like skirmishers from this distance. There were also 4 units forming a battle line behind the hill. And straight ahead, Kroq-Gar could see 2 hilltops between him and the city. If he could make it to the second hill, he would have his force directly between the Skaven force and the city, which meant that if they broke and ran, as the Ratmen were known to do, they'd be running away from the city, exactly the direction he wanted them to go. Kroq-Gar kept his units marching forward at a brisk but efficient pace. He wanted to conserve their energy for fighting, and the formation descended from the ridge down into the trees that filled the little valley. The last view Kroq-Gar had of his foe put them off to his left front flank. He could tell his troops were anxious to get the grips with the enemy because he could hear the unit commanders barking orders at their troops as their soldiers struggled to keep their aggression in check and their formations tight. Using the forest to obscure their movements, he sent his Cold One riders to a position near the closest flank of the enemy formation. If the enemy approached through the trees, his cavalry should be able to alert him in time to intercept. This also put the cavalry in a good position to flank, so long as they remained undetected. When they ascended the first hill, the Skaven didn't react, but to pivot their formation to face the Lizardmen. Kroq-Gar pressed on. He knew that if he hesitated, they may not make it to the hill he was aiming for, and his troops kept a wary eye on their left flank as their movement was exposing the left flank of their formation to the enemy. Some even snarled their disapproval. All the while, the Skaven just watched. As they crested the second hill, Kroq-Gar wheeled his formation around to the left so that his lines were parallel to the Skaven formation and called for a halt. As his troops settled into their spots, he watched and waited. He waited for the Skaven commander to realize that the Lizardmen were now between him and the city he was supposed to be defending. If the head Ratman ever figured it out, there was no outward sign of it. The Skaven just seemed to be standing across from the Lizardmen as if they were waiting for something to happen. Kroq-Gar waited for something to happen as well. When no ambush came, when no reinforcements arrived, and when no charge came, the Saurus Lord realized that the initiative was his. The Skaven had no surprises. They had no chance. The ground between his position and that of the Skaven contained a descent into a small valley lined with trees, and then an ascent up to a ridgeline on the opposing side. He ordered his formation forward, and they descended the hill and moved into the trees. Just as the front of his formation broke the line, the skirmishers atop the ridge moved forward, presumably to make room for this Skaven line to take the ridge behind them. Kroq-Gar had anticipated this and had planned to use the cover of the trees to obscure the execution of the surprise that he'd had planned. He shouted a command, and instantly the Stegodon charged forward to take the hilltop before the Skaven could reoccupy it. Saurus and Skink alike dove out of the way as the Stegodon thundered through the middle of the formation and broke clear of the tree line. Kroq-Gar halted his skink troops at the edge of the tree line and had them fire at the night runners as they came down the hill, throwing weapons of their own. And almost immediately, the Skaven skirmishers broke off to Kroq-Gar's right, away from the flying javelins and the raging Stegodon. And behind the Stegodon, he led his Saurus warriors straight up the hill. The Skaven front line advanced towards the ridge. When they crested the hill, they had expected to see Lizardmen struggling up the incline and to easily cut them down because they held the high ground. What they saw instead was several hundred tons of muscle and bone and fury running at a dead sprint from the trees right toward the middle of their lines. Just before impact, the Stegodon lowered his head, exposing his deadly horns and turning his bony skull into a giant plow. The Stegodon was deep into the Skaven ranks when he pitched his head back and flung scores of Skaven into the air. Some flew into the air high above the trees and then crashed to the earth in and around the formation, while others flew just barely over the heads of their compatriots, only to land in a broken heap dozens of yards behind the formation. Those in the path of the great beast were either gored or tossed away like leaves on the wind. Others were trampled under the enormous weight of the beast, or swept aside by the creature's tail as he spun, lunged, and stomped through the Ratman's formation. The initial assault was so terrible, it caused one unit of clan rats to flee in terror almost immediately. The Skaven tried in vain to stab and slash the Stegodon, but the creature's hide was just too thick and the scales too hard. As the 4 Skaven units moved to encircle the Stegodon, they noticed the Lizardmen charging up the hill. Initially, they'd moved to surround the Stegodon, but the Skaven commander caught his error and sent 2 of his units down to meet the Lizardmen. But even that was a mistake. Kroq-Gar quickly sandwiched each of the 2 units between 2 of his own units. Kroq-Gar spotted an opening and ordered the Cold One Riders around the open flank on the left side. Then, the Saurus Lord roared and charged into the fray himself. He grabbed one unlucky rat by the throat, lifted him high overhead, and then with his spear, he struck the wretched creature with such force that his broken corpse landed a good 30 yards away. Seeing this, the enemy unit realized that they were grossly outclassed, and they routed. Kroq-Gar and his infantry continued to bludgeon, hack, and stab any rat that was too slow to escape. The Cold One Riders emerged from the trees and circled around to the Skaven's rear unopposed. The skirmishers were their target. Scalpite and his unit were fighting on 2 fronts, as was the other unit he had sent to contest the Lizardmen battle line. The last-second maneuver he'd ordered had completely compromised the Skaven's flank on their right side. He could see the cavalry sweeping around through the opening, circling behind his formation. His troops, following his gaze, also witnessed his blunder and began to look for a way out. A few of the more opportunistic clan rats in his unit spotted an open path back towards the ruins and decided to use their speed advantage to escape the brutish Lizardmen. The less opportunistic, seeing their compatriots on the move, became a lot more opportunistic right around that time and followed. As the Night Runners hurled their thrown weapons at the Stegodon, almost all of them bounced harmlessly off the beast's scales. The weapons were too light to get much penetration, and in front of them the Skaven line had started to falter, and some were fleeing. The skirmishers were already backpedaling when they noticed the mounted Saurus warriors bearing down on them. They tried to run away, and some even hurled missiles at the cavalry in an effort to slow their advance, but it was too late. Most of the unit had their backs turned when they were overrun by the Cold One Riders. The Cold One Riders ran down the Night Runner unit under a hail of thrown missiles. With their shields held high to protect their heads, they ruthlessly charged into the rear of the formation. Some of the mounts leapt into the air to add their momentum to the riders' spear thrust. Others grabbed cowering rats in their massive jaws and flung them across the formation. The Skaven tried to use their superior numbers to surround and overwhelm the dozen or so cavalry units, but the lizards didn't seem to mind. Kroq-Gar ordered a few of his units to hold the ground that the Skaven had relinquished, and allowed the others to continue pursuing the fleeing Skaven and keep them on the run. The unit of Night Runners pinned down by his cavalry had proven to be rather tenacious. Even under heavy pressure, they stood and fought. Seeing this, he motioned to the Stegodon, and the great beast lowered his head and charged through their ranks. Still, they fought on. It wasn't until Kroq-Gar himself charged in their direction that they faltered. And when they finally broke and ran, Kroq-Gar sent his cavalry after the other unit of Night Runners. They were the only real threat left on the field at this point. The remaining Night Runners had seen what had happened to the other unit of skirmishers, so as soon as they saw the cavalry turn their way, they began hurling missiles at them and ran into the tree line. By weaving through the trees, the Ratmen had hoped to slow the much larger Cold Ones and perhaps evade them in the forest. They continued to hurl weapons at them, but the reptiles' hard scales and shields diminished the effect of their light weapons. The Skaven ran as fast as they could, but the lizards relentlessly pursued them. The inevitable came to pass as the cavalry caught up with them and the Night Runners began to fall to spear and tooth and claw. The only survivors were those who didn't look back and ran with reckless abandon. Scalpite was able to rally his fleeing unit and attempted to re-engage the Lizardmen. The fight didn't last long, as a unit of Saurus warriors had been pursuing them and descended upon his battered unit only to resume savagely bludgeoning his troops into the afterlife. The sight of a second unit of Lizardmen charging in their direction convinced his troops that all was lost, and they broke and ran. All across the battlefield, the Skaven commander could see his units running away, trailing corpses as the Lizardmen nipped at their heels. As the last of his units quit looking over their shoulder for leadership and focused on running away, so too did he. The Skaven garrison at the Serpent Coast was scattered into the four winds. With the last of the Skaven disappearing into the distance, Kroq-Gar turned his attention to the battlefield. He rallied his troops, and they all searched for survivors. As they searched the piles of corpses, they discovered that they were all Skaven. Some of the Lizardmen were wounded, but all were accounted for. As for the Skaven, over half of their number lay about the battlefield. Discovered amongst the casualties was a flaming sword. The Saurus that found it brought it to his general, and Kroq-Gar recognized it immediately. He saluted his soldier and took the weapon.
"The burning blade of Chotek,"
he announced, holding it high above his head for all to see.
"We take back great weapon from the rats. Kroq-Gar, use fire of Chotek to kill more Skaven. Cleanse all temple cities in Southlands."
The troops all roared at the proclamation. Kroq-Gar commanded that the temple city be purged of all Skaven influence. All of the corpses from the battle and the garbage that had been cleared out of the ruins were piled into a great pyre. With all of his warriors present, Kroq-Gar wordlessly ignited the pyre with the burning blade of Chotek, and they watched the fire as it eradicated all traces of the Ratmen. With the cleansing ceremony completed, he set his workers to work, rebuilding the temple and getting a skink foraging camp up and running. He was going to need food, lots of food, to support his troops, laborers, tradesmen, and the surrounding citizens. The next day, while Kroq-Gar and Ratok were going over a new marching formation that showed promise of increasing the distance his troops could cover each day, a skink emissary was brought into the camp by Kroq-Gar's sentries. The emissary reported that the dwarven lord Thrund Holdfast of Carrick Norn had agreed to the non-aggression pact proposed by Kroq-Gar.
"A pact with the dwarves?"
Ratok asked incredulously.
"Yes, dwarves are enemy of our enemies. Dwarves like to stay in mountains. With our promise, dwarves stay in mountains and fight enemies there,"
explained Kroq-Gar.
"Dwarves like trade. We need resources to build army."
Kroq-Gar went back to working on his route marching formation, effectively ending the discussion on the topic. Ratok saw the wisdom in the Saurus Lord's words, but he was still distrustful of the other races. He would have to learn more about diplomacy if he were to be effective counsel for Kroq-Gar. This Saurus was different than the others, it seemed. Kroq-Gar was far more capable than what he had come to expect from the other Saurus he'd had dealings with. Perhaps he will ask Lord Mazdamundi more about him the next time they commune. Kroq-Gar surveyed his camp and decided that he had done what he could do for the day. Tonight his troops would rest, but tomorrow at first light they would be marching. There were Skaven to kill.
You follow, Luke.